Okay, let me just pull up my slideshow here. Um, so I want to say a few things about what we might be talking about when we talk about childism, or at least what this term means for me. Well, I define childism as empowering children by transforming norms. So the overall goal is to enact a kind of normative transformation. So it's based on the idea that children are in some ways marginalized as children by systemic adultism or patriarchy, a pervasive and profoundly rooted historical adultism. In other words, by the ways that adult perspectives invisibly dominate language, discourse, power, and action, and so on, and thereby also invisibilize the specific experiences and differences of children and youth in many ways. So simply understanding children and youth as agents doesn't necessarily change these underlying normative assumptions. It can only extend to children the same constructs that have been designed around adulthood and by adults over all of history. Instead, there needs to be a critique and transformation of scholarly and societal norms in response to children's diverse lived experiences, to make these norms systemically age inclusive, whether it's across politics, power systems, culture, language, rights, law, relationships, family, myths, symbols, stories, or what have you. All the different things that other movements like feminism and anti-racism, for example, change thinking around. So I understand childism as similar to other kinds of shift in perspective. For example, I think it's similar to the shift that occurred from second to third wave feminism, or at least how that's often interpreted, from simple equality, a simple seeking of equality between men and women in terms of their agency, to instead trying to redefine and reconceptualize the terms on which that equality is based, the normative underpinnings of this inequality. I also see this as similar to critical race theory, which is not about colorblindness, seeking colorblindness, but rather developing systemic critiques of racialized imaginations in all their diversity and complexity. And it's similar to these other kinds of ideas of post-genderism, womanism, environmentalism, post-humanism, decolonialism, transhumanism, and such. For childism in particular, I think that the focus is not just on the deconstruction of age biases, but instead on a more complex kind of reconstruction of social imaginations, an interdependent movement of both deconstructing and reconstructing ideas and assumptions. And childism thereby generates new concepts. It might lead us to think of human relationality or relatedness as not just a horizontal kind of connection, but a deep interdependency. Not just for children, but for everybody. We might all be deeply interdependent in many ways on many different dimensions of our lives. Not just an abstract, but a kind of embodied understanding of human temporality. Not just a liberated way of including people in societies, but an empowered inclusion, one in which we are related to and interdependent on each other. So the word childism has been used in other ways. One of them was in the 1990s in literary theory, where Peter Hunt defined it as inviting adults to read as children. Researchers should see children's literature, and indeed any literature, through children's different ways of seeing. But the problem here is that this view tended to essentialize a child perspective. It tended to universalize a child perspective so that adults could then put themselves into it. And of course, there's no such thing as a universal child perspective. So that really came out of use after the 1990s, and I don't see it being used really anymore. Another way, the other major way that the word childism has been used is in psychoanalysis, originally developed by Elizabeth Young Bruhl, to mean prejudice against children. And her work had been in prejudice in general, in terms of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia. And she then applied that to children as well. But this is a deficit-oriented way of looking at children. It's a negative way, and it has its place, but it's really about adults' views of children. It's not about children themselves. It doesn't learn anything from childhood studies about children as diverse agents and socially constructed beings in and of themselves. It would be as if that we were to use the word feminism just to mean sexism. Then it would be a very limited term. So the way that the word childism is used here, and the way I use it, is around empowering children, and the way others have been using it as well. So it's really about positively transforming social norms, critiquing social norms and changing them, and doing that by including children's own diversities of understanding and experience in new ways of thinking and new ways of being in society. So obviously, childism in that respect draws very heavily on childhood studies and is based in childhood studies. It's based in the idea that children are socially constructed agents in and of themselves. Children are beings with voices, rights, citizenship, power, and so on. And they're social and historical constructions, or rather age and generations and childhood and such are social and historical constructions. But childism asks additional kinds of questions, which are not necessarily reducible to what happens in the field of childhood studies. One of them is, how are agency, participation, being, power, rights, and so on constructed in the first place? How have they been sedimented historically around adults and adult views, often without thinking of children as equally full human beings, or even as human beings as relevant at all? Also, how are important ideas and terms used outside of the field of childhood studies across all disciplines in the academy, whether focused on the study of children or not? For example, in political science, anthropology, literature, biology, and so on. So childism, in a certain sense, has legs to move into other disciplines, just as the term feminism is pervasive and necessary across pretty much all disciplines in the academy, and anti-racism and other concepts like that. Also, in what ways are children systemically marginalized by adultist structural norms in societies, not just in academic work, but across social experience and social power and social norms? And finally, how can societies transform to include and empower children's diverse lived experiences as children? How can they expand their systemic normative horizons to include children as equal beings, but not necessarily identical beings and persons in societies? So I think childism is in this way related to many kinds of movements and directions in childhood studies, such as child prism research, critical childhood studies, decolonialism, intergenerationality, child as method, and many other types of movements. So this is not an antagonistic relationship between childism and childhood studies. But how is it different? Well, I think that's part of our conversation today, but I think part of the difference for me has to do with normative transformation. That's sort of the key aim in childism, is to generate broader normative transformation around assumptions and beliefs and structures underlying the ways in which children are marginalized. So let me just end with a few quick examples. My own work has looked at, for example, democracy and children's engagement in voting, I have a book coming out next year called Give Children the Vote, How to Democratize Democracy. And what I argue there is that democracy, understood as rule by the people, systemically marginalizes children, and voting itself needs to be systemically reimagined, just as it has been throughout history when every new group has gained voting rights. And I argue for a kind of interdependent form of voting, not an independent form of voting that we have now, which I call proxy claim voting, so that everybody from birth to death has a proxy vote, whether they're a baby or an adult with dementia or cognitively impaired adult or someone or anybody or many other people who cannot necessarily vote on their own behalf, but that anybody of any age or any other and under any other criteria can claim their own vote for themselves when they desire it. I've also looked at how human rights have been conceptualized around adulthood and how they need to be conceptualized in a more thoroughly interdependent and age-inclusive or child-inclusive way to be truly human rights. And I've looked into the history of philosophy and religion and the ways in which these are sort of infested with patriarchal and adultist biases, but also at times have proto-childist elements in them as well. If you look on the Childism Institute website, you'll see a long list of ways in which Childism has been used. But here are some other examples. In the social sciences, there have been sociological studies of child transform policies, both on the local level and the national level, and also globally around, for example, climate change. So how has politics fundamentally transformed in terms of what it assumes politics is all about and what can be accomplished around children. Pedagogical inclusion of children and children's experiences in teacher learning processes or understanding teacher learning processes. How can these be reconceptualized around children's diverse input and differences? Or ethnographic fieldwork around, for example, girls changing cultural norms and social structures of societies. In the humanities, there have been literary studies of child-inclusive ways of reading and interpretation, changing the lens of what does it mean to read, what do texts mean when looked at in a childist way, just as people have studied how does feminism change how you read and think about texts. In history, there are histories of things like slavery and suffrage. There's a lot of work in biblical history, the history of biblical texts and contexts, and that in which those histories look differently when you look at them through a lens of age or childhood or childism. And there have been even some philosophical reconstructions of things like what is politics about, what is ethics, what is epistemology, when you think about them in these different kind of ways. So in all of these cases, children can be studied not just as objects, but also subjects who challenge social norms. They challenge underlying assumptions and beliefs that have been built up over history from adult perspectives. And so we can then develop through childism lenses or prisms or approaches for imagining societies more expansively and imagining human experience and other experiences much more expansively. So thank you very much. I hope you'll visit our website and join our listserv. And I look forward to the conversations we'll be having later throughout this session.